Hello there. Kia ora. Hey, look, I'm not in the office at the moment. I mean, I technically am. I'm doing this on a green screen to make it look like I'm somewhere else, but I am actually somewhere else. I'm touring around the country at the moment because it's summer and I need a little bit of a break, but I've got a special effects budget to spend. So I'm going to do what all good TV shows do in this case and set up a clip show with some older content just to rehash it and feed the algorithm. So feel free to sit down and reminisce or relive the horrors depending on which video it is, and hopefully you enjoy or at least don't get too depressed by it. And if you see me floating around, feel free to say hi. Recommend a good place for finding a bacon and egg pie. That's my mission, I think, for this particular journey, is to find the best bacon and egg pie in at least the North Island. We'll see what we can do on that one. Anyway, enjoy this particular piece of recycled content. I suppose it's good for the environment if I'm recycling this way. I don't know. Enjoy. Hello there. If you like these videos, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel so you can get more content like this, as well as a whole bunch of other random stuff that tends to crop up in my content. Now today we're going to be talking about something called predetermined susceptibility, and this is actually a relatively recent topic. Now, as you're probably aware, there's been a fair bit of research done into what makes somebody more susceptible into believing and spreading misinformation. And the latest research, and by latest I mean it came out last week, has given us our clearest picture yet as to what some of these sort of predetermined elements are that make somebody more susceptible to going out, believing and spreading misinformation. And the thing that'll probably not surprise you here is that a lot of it comes down to those boomers who don't know how to Facebook. But it is a hell of a lot more complicated than that. So let's do some digging. When it comes down to the kind of stuff that people are going to believe, there's actually two really big factors that come into play. The first is how susceptible they are to believing misinformation and disinformation, and a lot of research has recently been done into that for, I don't know, let's call it obvious reasons. The other is the type of social media platforms that they're on. So let's split this into two and look at the first part about the people who are actually susceptible to spreading misinformation and disinformation. And to do that, we need to take a quick look at that research that's just come out, because look how complicated this is. Now, essentially what they did was a bunch of surveys, where every time they did another round of survey questions, they just changed it and tweaked it a little bit so that they could see how people responded and how they reacted. We're talking massive survey responses across the United States, and that part is really important because the results do skew very much towards the Americans. And what they found was actually kind of fascinating. 55 indicators out there. 55 freaking things of who is going to be more susceptible into believing misinformation and disinformation. But it gets a lot more strategic than just who's susceptible. Researchers identified 4 core versions of misinformation that people were susceptible to. So that was general misinformation, anti-vaccine rhetoric, information or misinformation about the transmission mode of the virus, as well as a belief that this is a bioterrorist attack of some sort. And there are some indicators that are specific just to those individuals. So, for example, general misinformation tended to be something that people who had no insurance were a lot more susceptible to believing, whereas something like anti-vax rhetoric, one of their indicators were people who admitted that they have never actually looked up the official information on government or scientific websites around COVID-19. For transmission mode, it was actually people who are more likely to live in the suburbs than in the country or in urban areas. And for bioterrorism, Fox News, by a mile, was their biggest indicator as to whether or not somebody believed the release of COVID was one of those bioterrorist attacks that they scare everybody about. There were some common indicators, though, across all 4 of the different types of misinformation that they identified, and you're probably not going to be surprised much when you hear what they were. Generally speaking, people over the age of 40, which I do feel kind of personally attacked about, but the age groups are 40 to 49, so I kind of get it. People who have a more conservative outlook or a much more religious outlook on life. People who tended to have lower incomes, who had poorer education levels, so maybe finished high school or possibly a very little bit of university or tertiary study before they've dropped out. And the big one, social media as their main source of news because they don't trust mainstream media. Sound like anybody you know? Because it sounds like a few people I could think of off the top of my head. Now, the important thing to note here is that this American based research backs up international research that was done earlier in the year as well, with a lot of the common elements appearing over and over on international studies, particularly around the age group, the access to social media as a news source, the conservative belief system or religious based belief system, education levels as well was a big one. The big difference, though, with the international study was the trust levels in government. So, in countries that tended to be a lot more high trust, like your Scandinavian countries, for example, they tended to have less spreading of misinformation and disinformation because the government was seen as a much more reliable, truthful source of information out to help people. Whereas other countries, like the US, that wasn't necessarily the case. It was used as a tool for politics to try and divide people. And we've seen that kind of rhetoric happen here as well, where a concerted effort to make sure that there was distrust in the government was put out there and very public. And since then, we've seen a decline in the trust model with the government and an increase in the spread of misinformation and disinformation. Really complicated. But that's only half of the issue. The other half is social media platforms themselves and how we use them. Because that meme of the old dude on Facebook sharing everything, let's call him Tremaine for whatever reason, an old racist dinosaur who has no idea what the fuck he's talking about, that's actually surprisingly accurate, but not necessarily for the reasons that you think. We tend to put social media in a great big umbrella term of social media, but each platform actually works differently to the other. So, for example, on Facebook, you tend to have a lot more control over the information you see because you're friends with the people who are sharing that information. And then the algorithms kick in and go, you want more like the kind of stuff that your friends are putting out there. Whereas something like Twitter, which is much more of a town crier situation, you have a lot less control over the type of content that you're seeing come through, but you tend to follow people who have the same ideologies as yourself. Your education level comes into play as well around which port of social media you're going to be using. Generally speaking, people who have only just got a high school education or haven't finished a high school education tend to be on things like Facebook and Instagram, whereas people who have got higher levels of education tend to be on Twitter, Reddit, and LinkedIn. So you're automatically seeing very different things come through. On Facebook, you are less likely to see people push back on misinformation and disinformation because that's within your bubble that you've chosen to look at. Whereas on Twitter, with its town crier style of information sharing, you're tending to see a lot more pushback come through on it. Up until recently, that is. Something changed there, God knows what. It's a bit of a trash fire. But there are other elements that also come into play, like the fact that women tend to be more susceptible to framing around misinformation that's positive. So if we look at the local body elections recently, where we had Voices for Freedom as one organisation doing what it could to get its members elected, they framed that as us going out to fix the problems with this country. Look what we can do together. Whereas men tend to react more to framing around fear and anxiety, which was a lot more of the groundswell type of look what the government is doing to us, they're going to ruin your lives. And race definitely comes into play with this as well. People of colour tend to be less susceptible to misinformation and disinformation when it's framed in that fear and anxiety pose, but much more susceptible when it comes to being positive and sharing and all happy clappy kumbaya stuff. Whereas white people tend to react more to the fear and anxiety side of framing. So these elements all come in together and work with that first part of this video about the types of people who are susceptible to these things to create a perfect storm of misinformation and disinformation that gets spread without people realizing that they're doing it, without people realizing that they are the target audience for this. That's really kind of scary because the only real way to get around that is to realize that you're stuck in the system or that you are part of the more susceptible audience here that might, just might, be getting targeted by these organizations who want to spread misinformation and disinformation for whatever reason. Which is really frustrating.